The moment you stop forcing, something strange happens. Your mind doesn't relax, it reacts. You finally decide to stop pushing. Stop overthinking. Stop trying to make things happen. And instead of peace, your body tightens. Your thoughts speed up. There's a subtle panic, an urge to do something, anything, just to feel grounded again. This is the moment most people misunderstand. They think, if stopping feels this bad, I must be doing something wrong. So they go back to forcing, back to effort, back to control. But what if this reaction isn't a mistake? What if your mind isn't breaking down, but revealing how deeply it learned to survive through pressure? For a long time, forcing gave you structure. It gave your mind something to hold on to, a sense of direction, a feeling of movement. So when you stop forcing, the mind doesn't feel relief. It feels exposed. Because effort wasn't just about results, it was about safety. And without it, your system doesn't yet know what to rely on. This is why doing nothing feels wrong, why stillness can feel dangerous, why rest can trigger anxiety instead of calm. Your mind isn't reacting because peace is bad, it's reacting because peace is unfamiliar. And this reaction, this discomfort, is the doorway, not the problem. Because once you understand why your mind reacts this way, you stop fighting it and start seeing what it's been protecting you from all along. And that's where everything begins to shift. Here's something most people never realize. Your brain didn't become addicted to effort by accident. Effort gave it relief. Every time you pushed harder, planned more, or tried to control the outcome, your mind felt temporarily safer. Not because effort fixed everything, but because effort created the illusion of control. Control tells the brain, we're doing something, we're not helpless. So, over time, effort became regulation. When anxiety showed up, you responded with action. When uncertainty appeared, you responded with force. When fear surfaced, you responded with planning. And your brain learned a simple rule. If I try harder, I feel better, even if only for a moment. This is why stopping effort feels so uncomfortable. You're not just stopping an action, you're removing your brain's coping mechanism. It's like taking away a stabilizer before balance has fully developed. So when you pause, the brain panics. Not because something bad is happening, but because its usual method of self-soothing is gone. This is why rest can feel restless, why silence feels loud, why doing nothing feels irresponsible. Your brain equates effort with safety, and without effort, it doesn't yet know how to calm itself. So it creates urges, thoughts, mental noise, anything to pull you back into motion. But here's the quiet truth. Effort never actually solved the fear. It just distracted you from it. And now, without forcing, the fear finally has space to surface. That doesn't mean you're regressing. It means you're ready to see what effort was covering up. Because once effort loosens, something else becomes obvious. Forcing doesn't create clarity, it creates noise. And that's exactly what we need to talk about next. When you force, your mind gets louder, not clearer. This confuses a lot of people because effort is supposed to bring answers. So when you push harder and your thoughts multiply, you assume you just need to push more. But mental noise isn't a lack of intelligence. It's a signal of pressure. Forcing puts the mind into problem-solving mode, and problem-solving mode never rests. It scans, it evaluates, it predicts. What if this doesn't work? What should I do next? What am I missing? Each question creates another thought. Each thought demands another response. And soon, your inner world is crowded. This is why overthinking increases when you try to control outcomes. Why clarity disappears the moment you need it most. Why forcing decisions often leads to confusion instead of certainty. Pressure narrows perception. It tells the mind, something is wrong, fix it. So the mind talks, constantly. But here's the shift most people never make. Clarity doesn't come from pushing the mind harder. It comes from removing the pressure that's making it talk. When forcing stops, the mind doesn't go quiet immediately. First, it protests. It gets louder, more dramatic, more urgent, because it's losing the pressure it used to organize itself. This is why the moment you stop forcing, your thoughts can feel chaotic. That chaos isn't your natural state. It's withdrawal. The mind is detoxing from urgency. And once urgency fades, something surprising happens. The noise doesn't get replaced by silence right away. It gets replaced by space. And space can feel uncomfortable if you're used to stress filling every gap. Which brings us to the next layer. Why stress can feel familiar and calm can feel wrong. Stress doesn't always feel bad. Sometimes it feels normal. If your system learned to live in urgency, calm can feel suspicious. In stress, there's structure, deadlines, pressure, something to react to. In calm, there's space, and space doesn't tell you what to do, so the mind starts searching. Why am I relaxed? What am I missing? Something should be happening. This is why peace can feel wrong at first. Not because it is, but because your nervous system hasn't rehearsed it. Familiar stress feels predictable. You know the rules there. Push harder, think faster, stay alert. Unfamiliar calm has no script. There's no urgency to guide you, no anxiety to point the way. So the mind tries to recreate stress. It invents problems. It revisits old worries. It creates pressure out of nothing. Not because it wants chaos, but because chaos feels known. This is why people say they feel off when things are finally quiet. Why happiness can feel empty. Why rest can feel undeserved. Your system learned to associate aliveness with tension. So when tension leaves, the mind asks, "Am I still okay?" The answer is yes. But your system needs time to believe it. This is the transition most people don't recognize. They think something is missing. What's missing is stress. And stress leaving can feel like loss before it feels like relief. This explains why calm can feel uncomfortable and why control rushes in to replace it. Because control brings stress back, and stress feels familiar. Which leads us to the next layer. Control isn't a personality trait, it's a nervous system strategy. And once you see that, everything starts to make sense. Control didn't start as a flaw, it started as protection. At some point, staying on top of things kept you safe. Anticipating problems reduced shock. Planning ahead prevented pain. So, your nervous system learned a pattern. If I stay in control, nothing catches me off guard. Control became reassurance. It looks like responsibility, like discipline, like being put together. But underneath, it's vigilance. Your system is constantly scanning for what might go wrong, for what needs fixing, for what can't be trusted yet. And that constant scanning keeps the body alert. Control feels productive because it creates movement. It gives anxiety somewhere to go, but it comes at a cost. It keeps you braced. It keeps your breath shallow. It keeps rest conditional. Even when nothing is wrong, control says, stay ready. This is why letting go feels threatening. You're not just releasing outcomes. You're releasing the strategy your body used to feel safe. And the body doesn't surrender safety easily. So when control loosens, the nervous system asks, if I stop managing, what protects me? That question doesn't come as words. It comes as sensation, restlessness, tightness, the urge to intervene. Not because something needs fixing, but because control was filling a deeper role. And beneath control, there's usually a fear that hasn't been named yet. A fear that forcing was quietly covering. That fear is what we need to look at next. Beneath forcing, there's almost always a fear that hasn't had language. Not fear of failure, not fear of success. Something quieter, the fear of stillness. When you stop forcing, there's nothing to distract you from what's underneath. No movement, no urgency, no task to hide behind. And in that stillness, the mind feels exposed. For many people, forcing was never about getting somewhere faster. It was about avoiding a feeling. The feeling of not being needed, the feeling of not knowing, the feeling of not being in control of the outcome. Forcing keeps those feelings at bay. It gives the mind a role, a job, a reason to stay busy. So when you stop forcing, the mind asks a frightening question. If I'm not trying, what am I here for? This is why stillness can feel meaningless at first, why peace can feel empty, why rest can bring up sadness instead of relief. It's not that something is wrong, it's that something honest is finally being felt. Forcing was a way to stay ahead of uncertainty, to outrun vulnerability, and when that stops, vulnerability surfaces. But vulnerability isn't danger, it's sensitivity returning. It's awareness without armor, and most people were never taught how to stay with that. So they go back to forcing, back to effort, back to control. Not because they want stress, but because stress feels safer than openness. This is where manifestation often breaks down. Because forcing and vulnerability cannot coexist. And the moment you see this clearly, you realize something important. Pushing was never the solution, it was the avoidance, which explains why the harder you force manifestation, the less it seems to respond. And that's exactly what we need to explore next. Manifestation doesn't respond to effort the way the mind expects it to. It responds to availability. When you push, you're not just applying action, you're sending a signal. And that signal says, "I'm not okay yet." Forcing carries urgency. Urgency carries lack, and lack contracts the nervous system. This isn't spiritual punishment, it's mechanics. When you're forcing, your body is tense, your breath is shallow, your attention is narrow. You're not open, you're braced. And a braced system can't receive, it can only manage. This is why timing falls apart when you push, why opportunities feel blocked, why clarity disappears the moment you need it. Forcing collapses the field of possibilities. It tells reality, only this outcome will keep me safe. And that pressure creates resistance. Manifestation works best when your system feels neutral, not excited, not desperate. Neutral means open. This is why things often move when you stop trying so hard. Not because you stopped caring, but because you stopped signaling fear. The mind hates this idea because it wants to do something. But manifestation doesn't require more doing. It requires less interference. And when you finally stop forcing, something strange happens. Everything slows down. The signs fade. The momentum pauses. The noise quiets. And this is the moment that scares people the most, because it feels like nothing is happening. But this pause isn't failure, it's the system resetting. And no one tells you how disorienting that can feel. That's why the next phase catches people off guard, the phase where everything goes quiet. This is where most people panic. You stop forcing, and suddenly, everything feels still. No signs, no reassurance, no clear movement. The mind interprets this as danger. Did I mess this up? Should I be doing something? Why does it feel like nothing is happening? But here's what's actually happening. Your system is recalibrating. For a long time, momentum was fueled by pressure, by effort, by urgency. Now that pressure is gone, there's a pause while your nervous system learns a new baseline. This pause isn't empty, it's quiet. And quiet feels uncomfortable if you've been trained to equate noise with progress. Signs often disappear here, not because alignment is gone, but because reassurance would keep you dependent. This phase asks a different question. Can you feel safe without proof? Most people can't, yet. So they break the pause. They force movement. They reintroduce effort, not realizing the stillness was doing the work for them. Because in this pause, attachment loosens, patterns dissolve, old timelines quietly collapse. Nothing dramatic, nothing flashy, just a subtle undoing of what no longer fits. If you stay, if you don't rush to fill the silence, your system learns something new. That nothing bad happens when you don't interfere. And that lesson changes how you relate to everything. But the pause brings something else to the surface too. A question you may not expect. If you're not forcing, if you're not trying, who are you now? That question opens the next layer. For a long time, effort gave you an identity. You were the one who tried, the one who pushed through, the one who didn't give up. Effort wasn't just something you did, it was who you were. So when you stop forcing, there's a subtle identity collapse. Not dramatic, quiet. You're no longer fueled by pressure, no longer driven by urgency, and the mind doesn't know how to label this version of you yet. This is why sadness can appear during growth, why motivation dips, why you can feel strangely untethered even when nothing is wrong. You're grieving an old role, the one who survived by striving, the one who stayed relevant by trying harder, the one who felt worthy because they were always doing. No one teaches us how to grieve an identity, so most people panic and rush to replace it. They set new goals, create new pressure, invent new problems. Not because they want stress, but because stress feels like self. But if you don't rush, if you let the old identity loosen without immediately replacing it, something honest emerges. a version of you that doesn't need effort to exist. This phase can feel empty because effort used to fill every space. Now there's room for something new. But before that new identity stabilizes, there's a stretch of time that feels deeply uncomfortable. A place where you're no longer who you were and not yet who you're becoming. That place has a name, the void, and it's where most people turn back. The void doesn't announce itself. It just arrives as a feeling, a sense of being unanchored. Not unhappy, but not driven either. Nothing feels urgent. Nothing feels exciting. Nothing feels wrong. Yet nothing feels clear. And the ego hates this because the ego survives on definition, on roles, on movement. So in the void, the mind panics. It whispers, "You're wasting time. You're losing momentum." This is how people fall behind. But the void isn't a setback. It's a reset. It's the space between old patterns dissolving and new ones forming. In nature, nothing grows while it's being disturbed. Seeds break open in stillness. The void is stillness your system hasn't learned to trust yet. This is why people self-sabotage here. They create urgency, restart forcing. Return to familiar stress, because stress feels like progress. But what they're really doing is avoiding the discomfort of not knowing who they are without pressure. If you can stay just a little longer, the void begins to change. It stops feeling empty and starts feeling spacious. And in that space, something else shows up. Not motivation, not urgency, awareness. And awareness brings sensations most people misinterpret. Restlessness, anxiety, the urge to do something. These aren't signs you're failing. They're withdrawal symptoms, your mind detoxing from effort. And once you understand that, you stop reacting to the next phase, the phase where the mind tries to pull you back. That's what we need to talk about next. When effort leaves, the mind doesn't relax right away. It protests. This phase feels uncomfortable because it mimics anxiety. But it's not anxiety caused by danger. It's anxiety caused by change. Your mind is used to regulating itself through motion, planning, fixing, pushing. So when that motion stops, it doesn't know what to do with the energy. The result is restlessness, an itch to act, a sense that you should be doing something right now. Thoughts speed up. Old worries resurface. New problems appear out of nowhere. This is not intuition, it's withdrawal. Just like the body reacts when a stimulant is removed, the mind reacts when pressure disappears. It says, "Something's wrong. Go back. This isn't safe." But notice something important. Nothing external has actually changed. The discomfort is internal. It's your system adjusting to a new way of being. This is why so many people relapse into forcing here. They misinterpret the discomfort as a signal to act. But if you don't act, if you stay, the symptoms peak and then soften. The mind learns that nothing bad happens without urgency. That lesson rewires everything, because once the withdrawal passes, you can finally see the next illusion clearly. The illusion that movement equals progress. And that's the trap we're stepping into next. For a long time, movement felt like proof. If you were busy, you were advancing. If you were doing something, you were improving. But movement and progress are not the same thing. Forcing creates motion. Alignment creates direction. When you're forcing, things look active on the surface. Plans, steps, effort. But underneath, nothing actually shifts. The same loops repeat. The same emotional states return. The same outcomes circle back. Because activity can distract you from stagnation. This is the illusion. Your mind learned to equate doing with becoming. So when you stop forcing, it feels like you've stopped progressing. But what's really happening is that false motion has ended. Real progress often feels slow, quiet, subtle. It doesn't announce itself with urgency. It doesn't demand constant attention. It reorganizes you from the inside. This is why real change can feel boring at first. There's no drama, no adrenaline, just a steady recalibration. The mind resists this because it can't measure it easily. It wants visible markers, immediate feedback. So it tempts you back into busy work, back into strategies, back into effort that looks productive. But once you stop confusing motion with movement, something becomes clear. The most important shifts don't happen when you're pushing forward. They happen when pressure leaves, and the system finally has space to reorganize itself. And when that reorganization begins, your mind starts behaving very differently. Quieter, clearer, more precise. That's what we're stepping into next. When pressure leaves, the mind doesn't collapse, it reorganizes. But this reorganization is subtle, so most people miss it. At first, thoughts slow down, not disappear. They become less sticky. They don't pull you in the same way. Problems that once felt urgent start to feel optional. You still think, but you're not trapped inside the thinking. This is because pressure was keeping your mind in survival mode. And survival mode prioritizes speed, not clarity. Without pressure, the mind no longer has to rush. It stops scanning for threats. It stops rehearsing worst-case scenarios. And in that space, intuition gets louder. Not dramatic intuition, quiet intuition, a simple sense of yes or no. A knowing without explanation, a feeling of not now without anxiety. Decisions become simpler because they're no longer fear-based. You don't need to convince yourself. You don't need to overanalyze. The mind becomes a tool again, not a battleground. This is why clarity often arrives after you stop trying to figure things out. Not because you gave up, but because you removed the pressure that was scrambling your perception. However, this quieter mind introduces a new challenge. Without pressure, emotional intensity fades. And for many people, intensity was mistaken for meaning. So when the mind calms, something else appears. Neutrality. And neutrality is one of the most misunderstood states in the manifestation and spiritual world. Because it doesn't feel like what people expect alignment to feel like. That's what we need to unpack next. Neutrality doesn't feel like excitement. It doesn't feel like motivation. It doesn't feel like certainty. It feels steady. And because it's quiet, many people assume something is missing. They think, if I were really aligned, I'd feel happier. Or, if this were working, I'd feel more energy. But neutrality isn't emptiness. It's the absence of emotional volatility. It's what happens when your nervous system is no longer swinging between hope and fear. In neutrality, you still care. You still want things. But those wants don't hijack your body. Your breath stays deep. Your thoughts stay flexible. Your attention stays present. This state can feel boring if you've been addicted to emotional spikes. Because drama trained you to associate intensity with importance. So when intensity fades, the mind asks, is this it? Yes, this is it. Neutrality is where your system is finally available. Available to notice timing. Available to respond instead of react. Available to receive without bracing. This is why manifestation often starts moving here. Not with fireworks, but with quiet openings. A conversation that feels easy. A decision that feels obvious. An opportunity that doesn't require convincing. Neutrality doesn't chase outcomes. It allows them. But there's one more shift required to stay here. Because even in neutrality, desire still exists. And how you relate to desire determines whether neutrality deepens or collapses back into tension. That distinction between desire and attachment is where the next layer unfolds. Desire doesn't disappear when you stop forcing. It changes shape. Before, desire was tight, urgent, loaded with emotion. It said, I need this to happen so I can relax. I'll feel okay once this arrives. That kind of desire isn't really desire, it's dependency. And dependency puts pressure on the future. When you stop forcing, desire becomes lighter, cleaner. It still exists, but it doesn't pull your nervous system forward. You can think about what you want, without your body leaning into it. This is the difference between expansion and contraction. Attachment contracts. It shortens your breath, narrows your focus, turns the future into emotional life support. Clean desire expands. It inspires without gripping. It allows timing without urgency. This is why people say, I wanted it, but I didn't need it. Need creates tension. Want creates openness. And openness is what allows movement. At first, this can feel risky. If you don't need the outcome, the mind worries you'll lose motivation. But motivation rooted in tension was never sustainable. It was fear-driven. When fear leaves, desire becomes curiosity instead of pressure. You explore possibilities without demanding results. This is a higher functioning state of wanting. And it sets the stage for the next shift, the one that scares people the most. Because once tension leaves desire, control loosens further, and that brings you face to face with trust. Not conceptual trust, embodied trust, the kind that feels unsafe, before it feels free. That's where we're going next. Trust doesn't arrive as confidence. It arrives as not knowing what comes next. And that's why it feels unsafe at first. When you stop forcing, you remove the mental scaffolding you used to lean on. No more constant planning, no more rehearsing outcomes, no more checking for reassurance. Without those habits, the mind feels exposed. It says, how do we move forward if we're not predicting? How do we stay safe if we're not preparing? This is the free fall phase, not because you're actually falling, but because the illusion of ground has disappeared. Control used to feel like ground, effort felt like traction, urgency felt like direction. Trust removes all of that at once, and for a moment, there's nothing to grab. That moment scares people into going back to forcing, back to doing, back to familiar tension. But if you stay, if you let the free fall happen, your system discovers something important. Nothing collapses. Life doesn't punish you for relaxing. Reality doesn't fall apart when you stop micromanaging. And slowly, the free fall transforms. What felt like dropping starts to feel like being held, not held by certainty, but by presence. This is when trust stops being an idea and becomes a sensation. But right before this stabilizes, there's a subtle interruption that almost always appears. The mind tries one last time to step in, one last urge to interfere, and if you don't recognize it, it can pull you right back into effort. That moment, the exact moment the mind stops interfering, is what we need to explore next. There's a moment that's easy to miss because nothing dramatic happens. No announcement, no emotional surge, no sudden certainty. The mind just steps back. You notice you're no longer checking as often, no longer rehearsing conversations in your head, no longer scanning for signs every few minutes. Not because you decided to stop, but because the urge faded. This is what it feels like when interference ends. The mind isn't silent, it's cooperative. Thoughts still appear, but they don't hijack your attention. You respond instead of react. You notice instead of chase. And in that space, presence replaces anticipation. This is the state people describe as flow. But it's quieter than that word suggests. There's less urgency, less inner commentary, less pressure to manage outcomes. You're not detached. You're available. Available to notice timing. Available to feel when something is right or not yet. Available to move when movement is natural. The mind stops trying to lead and becomes an instrument again. And when that happens, life begins to respond differently. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. Which is why many people don't recognize what comes next. Manifestation doesn't explode into your life. It starts to move. Softly, normally, almost anticlimactically. And that's what we need to talk about next. When manifestation starts moving again, it rarely feels like a miracle. There's no shock, no rush of disbelief, no emotional explosion. Things just line up. A message arrives without effort. A conversation opens naturally. A decision feels obvious instead of stressful. And because you're not bracing anymore, nothing feels urgent. This confuses people. They expect manifestation to feel dramatic, like something extraordinary has happened. But alignment feels normal. That's the sign. When you're not forcing, reality doesn't need to push back. There's no resistance to break through, no emotional charge to work around. Movement happens in small, ordinary ways. And those small movements compound. This is why people say, it happened when I wasn't trying. Not because they forgot their desire, but because they stopped squeezing it. The mind isn't interfering anymore, so timing can breathe. You act when it's natural. You wait when it's not. Both feel fine. This is manifestation without strain, without pressure, without emotional bargaining. But just when things begin to flow, another fear often appears. A subtle one. What if I lose momentum? That fear pulls many people back into forcing, right as alignment is settling in. And understanding that fear is key to staying in flow. That's what we're stepping into next. Just when things begin to feel easier, the mind raises a quiet concern. If I don't keep pushing, won't everything slow down? This fear is deeply conditioned. You've been taught that momentum comes from effort, that consistency means pressure, that ease equals laziness. So when life starts responding without strain, the mind worries it's temporary. It says, don't relax too much. Stay sharp. Keep the edge. This is the old system trying to stay relevant. Because momentum used to be created by urgency, by deadlines, by fear of falling behind. But that kind of momentum was never stable. It burned energy faster than it produced results. Real momentum doesn't come from force. It comes from coherence. When your nervous system is regulated, your actions are timely. Your decisions are clean. Your energy is conserved. You're not pushing the river. You're moving with the current. But trusting this feels risky. If you've never experienced momentum without pressure before. So the mind suggests going back, just a little. Checking more often, planning further ahead, adding effort just in case. This is where many people unknowingly disrupt flow. Not because they failed, but because they didn't recognize the fear. The fear isn't that things will stop working. It's that ease will disappear if you don't protect it. But ease doesn't need protection. It needs allowance. And that requires a deeper shift. You must relearn what safety feels like without control. That's the next layer. Safety used to come from control, from knowing, from staying ahead. So when control loosens, your body asks a new question. If I'm not managing, what keeps me safe? This is where the real work happens. Because safety doesn't come from certainty. It comes from regulation. When you slow your breath, when your shoulders drop, when your attention returns to what's actually here, your nervous system starts learning a new rule. I can be okay without predicting the future. This isn't passive. It's embodied. You notice sensations without fixing them. You let uncertainty exist without rushing to resolve it. You stay present even when there's no plan. At first, this feels unnatural, because control used to be your grounding. But over time, your system updates. Stillness stops feeling dangerous. Silence stops feeling empty. Not knowing stops feeling like a threat. Safety moves from the future into the present. And when safety is present, something counterintuitive happens. You start doing less and creating more. Because your energy is no longer leaking into worry. Your attention is no longer split. This sets the stage for a shift most people don't believe is possible. Effortless effectiveness. And that's what we're stepping into next. This is where logic starts to break down, in a good way. You're doing less, thinking less, forcing almost nothing. And yet, things move. Emails get answered, opportunities appear, problems resolve with fewer steps. Not because you're lucky, but because you're no longer fighting yourself. When pressure leaves, energy consolidates. It stops scattering into worry, overplanning, and second-guessing. Your actions become precise instead of frantic. You do the right thing, not everything. This is why aligned action feels lighter. It's not about doing nothing. It's about doing what matters without resistance. Most people never experience this because they don't trust it. The moment things get easier, they add effort back in. They think ease is fragile, that it needs to be protected with work. But ease is not fragile. It's efficient. The reason doing less creates more is because your nervous system is no longer leaking energy into fear. You're not dragging the future toward you. You're meeting it. And yet, even here, a strange emotion can surface. A quiet sense of loss. Because when peace replaces urgency, something familiar disappears. And that disappearance can feel unsettling. That's what we need to talk about next. When peace arrives, it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't celebrate, and it doesn't demand attention. It just settles in. And that can feel strangely sad, because peace replaces intensity. It replaces urgency. It replaces the emotional spikes you used to live inside. If chaos was familiar, peace can feel empty by comparison. Not empty because something is missing, but because something loud has finally gone quiet. Many people don't expect this. They think peace will feel like happiness, but peace feels like stability. And stability can feel dull. If your nervous system was trained on drama, there's a kind of grief here, not for what you lost externally, but for the version of you that survived through intensity. That version knew how to react, how to push, how to stay relevant through effort. When peace arrives, that version isn't needed anymore. So there's a letting go, not just of force, but of emotional identity. This is why people sometimes sabotage calm moments, why they reintroduce stress, why they say, "I don't feel like myself." What they mean is, "I don't feel my old survival patterns." And that's not a problem, it's a transition. Peace isn't empty, it's quiet power. But before that power is felt, the system needs time to adjust. And as peace stabilizes, something you may have missed begins to return. Not excitement, not urgency, something subtler. Intuition. And intuition sounds very different. When the mind is no longer forcing, that's what we're stepping into next. When forcing fades, intuition doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't interrupt your thoughts. It doesn't argue its case. It simply becomes noticeable again. For a long time, intuition was there, but it was crowded out by urgency, by planning, by fear-based thinking. Effort drowned it out. When the mind was constantly asking, "What should I do? What's the next step? What if this goes wrong?" Intuition didn't compete. It waited. Now, without pressure, you start to hear it. Not as words, but as clarity. A quiet yes, a gentle number. A sense of not yet without anxiety. This kind of intuition doesn't rush you. It doesn't scare you into action. It doesn't demand certainty. It feels neutral, simple, almost obvious. This is why people miss it at first. They expect intuition to feel dramatic or mystical, but real intuition feels ordinary. It shows up as ease in one direction and resistance in another, without explanation. And because you're no longer forcing, you can actually listen. You don't override it with logic. You don't argue with it. You don't need to justify it. You respond. This is how decision-making changes when pressure leaves. Choices feel cleaner. Regret diminishes. You stop second-guessing, not because you're certain, but because you're aligned. And once intuition is trusted again, something else begins to fall away. The need for constant techniques, affirmations, methods, mental gymnastics, they start to feel unnecessary. Not because they were wrong, but because you no longer need to force alignment. Which brings us to a surprising realization. Manifestation doesn't require techniques when your system is already coherent. That's what we're exploring next. This is where things simplify in a way most people don't expect. You don't stop manifesting, you stop trying to manifest. Techniques begin to feel optional. Not wrong, just unnecessary. Affirmations once gave your mind something to do. Visualizations once helped you focus. Methods once created structure. They were scaffolding. But when your nervous system is regulated, scaffolding isn't needed. You're already aligned. Manifestation doesn't require repetition. When belief isn't being questioned, it doesn't require effort. When desire isn't tangled with fear. This is why advanced practitioners often look lazy from the outside. They're not chasing outcomes. They're responding to life. They don't rehearse the future. They don't manage the field. They stay present, and reality responds. This is embodiment over technique. Being replaces doing. And this shift can feel disorienting. Because without techniques, the mind asks, what am I supposed to do now? The answer is simple, but not easy. Live, notice, respond. Rest when it's time. Move when it's natural. Manifestation becomes less about creating and more about allowing. Not allowing from passivity, but from trust. And when this state stabilizes, it becomes your new baseline. Not a peak experience, not a temporary calm, a default. Which raises a powerful question. What if this regulated, unforced state is who you were always meant to be? That's what we're stepping into next. At some point, you realize something quietly profound. This calm isn't temporary. You're not in a good phase. You're not riding a high. You're not waiting for the other shoe to drop. This is just how things feel now. Your nervous system isn't on standby anymore. It's not waiting for the next problem. It's not scanning for danger in neutral moments. Calm becomes normal, not blissful, not euphoric, stable. Your emotions still move, but they don't hijack you. Challenges still arise, but they don't collapse you. Uncertainty still exists, but it doesn't feel threatening. This is the new baseline, and it changes how you relate to everything. You don't chase clarity, you notice it. You don't manage emotions, you feel them. You don't force outcomes, you respond to timing. Life feels less like a test and more like a conversation. This is why people say, "I feel like myself again." But it's not a return to the old self. It's a return to a version of you that doesn't require tension to function. However, this baseline isn't maintained by effort. It's maintained by softness. And that brings us to the final challenge. Because life doesn't stop testing this state. Stressors return, deadlines appear, old triggers knock. And in those moments, there's a choice: to harden or to stay open. That choice is the final test, and that's what we need to explore next. This is the part no one warns you about. Life doesn't pause just because you found calm. Deadlines return, unexpected messages arrive, old triggers resurface. And when they do, there's a familiar pull: to tighten, to rush, to go back to forcing. Staying soft doesn't mean avoiding stress. It means meeting stress without armoring against it. Softness is not weakness, it's flexibility. When something challenging appears, you notice the instinct to harden, to control, to prepare for impact. And instead of obeying it automatically, you pause, you breathe, you stay present. This is the real practice. Not staying calm when life is easy, but staying open when it's not. Old habits will try to convince you that softness is unsafe under pressure. But pressure is exactly where softness proves its strength. Because when you stay open, you don't waste energy resisting reality. You respond clearly, you act precisely, you recover quickly. This is how the new baseline becomes resilient, not by protecting it with effort, but by trusting it under stress. And each time you stay soft. When the old urge to force appears, something integrates deeper. You're no longer practicing letting go. You're living it. Which brings us to the final phase. The one where everything settles without effort. Integration. Integration doesn't feel like a breakthrough. It feels like nothing needing your attention. You're no longer reminding yourself to trust. You're no longer practicing letting go. You're no longer monitoring your state. Those things fall away naturally. What replaces them is a quiet confidence. Not the loud kind that proves itself, but the steady kind that doesn't need validation. You notice that even when uncertainty appears, your body doesn't rush to fix it. Even when emotions move through you, they don't hijack your direction. This is how you know integration has happened. There's less inner commentary, less self-correction, less effort spent managing yourself. You're not trying to stay aligned. You are aligned. And alignment here doesn't mean perfection. It means coherence. Your thoughts, body, and actions are no longer pulling in different directions. This is why manifestation feels simpler now. Not because you've mastered a system, but because you've stopped interfering with one. You don't need reminders. You don't need techniques. You don't need reassurance. Life feels cooperative instead of confrontational. And perhaps the most surprising part, you don't feel the need to explain this state to anyone. There's no urgency to convince, no desire to prove, because forcing has ended internally. And when forcing ends internally, the external world follows quietly. This is where people often say, "I don't feel like I'm doing anything, but everything is working." That's integration. But before we close, there's one final truth worth naming, because the mind will always try to reinterpret what happened, to claim credit, to create a new method. So the last part isn't about learning something new. It's about remembering what was always true. And that's where we end. If there's one thing to remember from everything you've heard, it's this. Your mind didn't react differently when you stopped forcing because something went wrong. It reacted differently because something ended. Forcing was never your natural state. It was a survival response, a way to stay ahead, a way to feel relevant, a way to protect yourself from uncertainty. And for a time, it worked. But what works to survive is not what works to live. When you stopped forcing, your system didn't collapse. It reorganized. It learned that safety doesn't come from pressure, that clarity doesn't come from urgency, that movement doesn't require strain. You didn't lose motivation. You lost fear-driven momentum. You didn't become passive. You became available. And that availability is what allowed everything else to fall into place. This is why peace felt unfamiliar at first, why calm felt like loss, why stillness triggered doubt. You weren't broken, you were healing out of a pattern. That told you effort was the price of worth. The truth is quieter than that. You were never meant to force timing. You were never meant to brace for life. You were never meant to carry the future on your shoulders. Your role was always simpler: to notice, to respond, to stay present when the urge to harden appeared. And every time you chose softness over force, your system learned something new: that it could trust life without controlling it, that it could move forward without pushing, that it could be okay without proving anything. So if you feel calm right now, let it be. If you feel uncertain, let that be too. Nothing here needs fixing. You don't need to hold on to this message. You don't need to apply it perfectly. Just remember how your body feels. When you stop forcing, even for a moment, that feeling is the direction. And if you ever find yourself tightening again, this isn't something you failed to learn. It's something you can return to. Because you didn't discover a technique here, you remembered a state. And that state has been waiting longer than you realize. Before you move on, pause for one breath, longer on the exhale. If this experience met you in a quiet way, you may want to return to it, so save it. If this kind of grounded, nervous system-aware spirituality resonates with you, subscribe. And if someone in your life is pushing themselves through everything, share this with them. Not to change them, but to offer a moment of rest. You don't need to force the next step. You never did.